is that whilst I still experience anxiety, I no longer suffer with it. But I didn't achieve this shift by trying to get rid of it. Now, don't get me wrong, back in the day, that's exactly what I was trying to do. I would do all I could to avoid any anxiety-inducing situation. I would arrange my daily movements, specifically avoiding social situations. If I felt anxiety starting to flare up, I'd run away. I'd do all I could to retreat to safety and then employ various distraction techniques to take my mind away from the horribly uncomfortable feeling that something bad was about to happen. But it turns out that was my big mistake. You see, you don't get rid of anxiety by trying to get rid of it. Truth is, you don't get rid of anxiety at all. Now, by some twist of fate, or perhaps as a direct result of what I went through back then, I now work with anxiety sufferers to help them understand and ultimately overcome those feelings. I've spent a large part of the last 10 years talking to anxiety sufferers about their anxiety. And whilst all those I spoke to had their own individual story, their own personal journey with anxiety, every single one of them at some point expressed exactly the same desire that I used to have, the desire to get rid of anxiety completely. Can you imagine if we all achieved that? A world without anxiety? What would that even look like? Well, for example, this room would probably look empty. Anxiety is the feeling that tells us when something is worth demanding our attention. So in some small way, it was anxiety that reminded you had somewhere to be today. Without it, none of us would have turned up, and those that accidentally did would be watching an empty stage. None of us would have businesses, careers, because we wouldn't have regarded study and gaining qualifications as worth bothering with. And none of us would have boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, or wives either here or at home, because we just wouldn't have seen the value of washing and dressing up to make a good impression on that all-important first date that we probably forgot to turn up to. So it seems anxiety is important. But of course there are those that don't feel anxiety. There are two very distinct groups. The first group, dead people. Dead people don't feel anxious. You know, and I think that's okay. They're dead. They've got enough to not worry about. The second group would be those we might refer to as psychopaths. Those people that, for whatever reason, lack the ability to have any concern for the consequences of theirs or anyone else's actions. Now, I don't know how you were brought up, but when I was a kid, I was given the distinct impression that being part of either of these two groups would be undesirable. So if being free of anxiety would be such a bad idea, why do we regard feeling anxious so negatively? Now, I think the very obvious answer to that question is that it feels horrible. When we suffer high levels of anxiety over a long period of time, it can very quickly start to dominate our life, even go on to define our existence. Of course we're going to try and get rid of it. But what if we can't? What if all of our attempts to control our anxiety response ultimately fail? Then where do we go? I think most people go along to their local doctor. And I should state at this point, I'm a big fan of doctors. They've saved my life on more than one occasion, and I feel a tremendous amount of sympathy for them when it comes to treating anxiety issues, because it's really not what they signed up for, and it's certainly not what they're trained for. When it comes to anxiety, doctors are restricted in three important ways. Firstly, time. You get somewhere between 8 and 11 minutes for an appointment with your local GP, which is nowhere near enough time to effectively diagnose and treat an anxiety issue. Secondly, knowledge. Doctors are taught that anxiety is a mental health condition, and yet they're not mental health specialists. If a doctor wishes to become one of those, they have to train for a further 5 or 6 more years to become a psychiatrist. And thirdly, resources. Doctors are given precious little support when it comes to actually treating anxiety. They can put you on a 12 to 16 week waiting list for some form of counselling, but by the time we got to the doctor, we're probably in such desperate need of assistance that being told we now have to wait 3 or 4 months to talk to somebody is not helpful. That leaves the only other option, medication. I'm not a fan of medicating anxiety. Now, whilst I'm well aware that taking drugs can change the way we feel, Back in the 90s, I witnessed many of my friends on a Saturday night discovering that very simple truth. But with medication comes all sorts of unpredictable and unpleasant side effects. And in the unlikely event we do find the drug that agrees with you, that calms your anxiety response without any side effects, then of course it's all too easy to now regard ourselves as dependent on that drug. And then the possibility of developing a dependency on our anti-anxiety medication just becomes something else to feel anxious about. The truth is, a medical solution to a non-medical problem will not solve that problem. It will at best just patch over it for a short while. Now, the irony here is that most of the people I've spoken to, they already know all of this. They know the doctor is not a great option for our anxiety, which then begs the very obvious question, so why do we go there? I believe we go there because these days we are told anxiety is an illness. And this is perhaps the one certain result of going to the doctor for your anxiety. You will come away from there labelled with an anxiety issue, maybe even diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And now you have a brand new thing to feel anxious about. During the thousands of conversations I've had with anxiety sufferers, there was a common thread. When asked what they felt most anxious about, the answer was generally how anxious they felt, and if it would ever stop. This concern is almost entirely created and fueled by the idea that anxiety is an illness. Anxiety is not an illness. Anxiety is an emotion. Every emotion is important. Every emotion has a purpose. Every emotion is a natural and vital part of our human experience. In that respect, anxiety is no more sinister than any other feeling we might have. If we didn't feel anxiety, we'd be one emotion short of the full set. That really would be a disorder. I want to share with you now an analogy that might go some way towards helping us understand our emotional responses. I want you to think of your mind like a ship. Every ship has a captain and a crew. In this analogy, the captain is your logical, rational, conscious part of your thinking. It's the part that knows where you want to go, why you want to go there, and it has a fair idea of how you think you're going to get there. Unfortunately, the part of our mind that has its hands on all the things that steer and sail our ship, that's the crew. That's your subconscious. Your subconscious is in charge of all of your automatic responses. So your patterns of thought and behavior, your belief systems, and perhaps most importantly, your emotions. Your crew sail your ship by triggering the appropriate emotional responses. So for example, if we regard something as dangerous, our crew might trigger the feeling of fear. We'll become uncomfortable, and this feeling will encourage us to move away from the danger to return to comfort. If we believe we've been wronged, a member of our crew might trigger anger. We'll energize, and our focus will be drawn towards taking whatever action is necessary to right the wrong. So what about anxiety? Why do our crew trigger that particular emotion?